thank you. Let me pick up from where the chairman left off here, and that is the diplomatic aspect of this. I think probably anybody that operates in this lane on diplomacy can't be more disgusted with the UN than it is right now. I mean, what good is this institution where you have a permanent member of the UN Security Council violating the basic precept and the reason that the UN exists, and that was for security for nations, for their sovereignty, and for their borders. I mean, it's just, I went round and round with the Secretary General on this. What we send billions there, and what do we get? Speeches, nothing more. And they can't even, not only can't they stop this, which they should, they can't even pass a resolution condemning it because of the way the UN is set up. So I'm disgusted there. But that just means that we've got to pay more attention on a bilateral basis with our diplomacy. That brings me to an interesting point that you made, Ms. Taylor, and that is I've been visited, and I suspect other members of the Senate have been visited by countries that are former countries in the orbit, and the stands, obviously, is primarily what I'm talking about. And I was amazed at their lack of support for what Russia's doing. I mean, they came to tell me, hey, we got nothing to do with this. Now, I hadn't seen them. I hadn't talked to them in years, but they voluntarily showed up and said, look, we want you, the United States, to know we got nothing to do with this. And I was amazed that Putin called on them to step up and send people and supplies and weapons and everything else, and they haven't done it. So I think there's a real opportunity there, and I think that we really ought to exploit it. And I think it underscores the disgust that the world has with what Russia's doing there. One of the other things that always strikes me is how and I guess I shouldn't be, because it is an autocracy where people can't speak out. But it always amazes me how the Russian people come to defense of this. I mean, I don't know how you can watch what's happened in Ukraine, the atrocities that have been committed there, on a par with the kinds of things that happened in World War II, and say, well, you know, this is all right because they wanted to join NATO or something like that. What's your view on? Is there any? Both of you are experts in the area. Is there, what's it like at home in Russia? You live there, Ambassador Sullivan, you live there. What do you hear from the people there when they whisper in your ear?
Well, thank you, Senator Risch. I think there are several things going on. First, the media environment in Russia is merely state propaganda. It is what the Russians 24/7. They have to really seek out other sources of information if they don't just want to hear the Kremlin's propaganda. And many of them, they've got other things to do with their lives. They're just steeped in it all day long. Second, this is a country dating back to Soviet days where people just did what they needed to do to survive. They kept their heads down, they shut up, they didn't make a scene, and that's what most Russians, I believe, many Russians are doing now. There are some who have fled, there are some who tried to protest, they've been sent to labor camps, but there's a large segment of the population who, as they did in Soviet days, sort of keep their head down and try not to attract attention. There comes a point, however, where the effects in Russia of the special military operation will become so grave, in my opinion, whether it's because of casualties or the continuing effect on the economy, where there will, as Dr. Kendall Taylor said, there will be that bubbling up from below. But it's a country that has been, dating back again to Soviet days, they've dealt with this. The Russian people, as the Russian Federation, part of the Soviet Union, they've dealt with these types of situations before in ways that Americans can't imagine.
Even the younger generation?
The younger generation is, born since the Cold War ended. Many of them are nationalists. They hear the World War II propaganda that Putin spews, that this is what our grandparents did in defeating the Nazis. They want to rally around their country. There are a lot of young Russian nationalists who are buying into this, I'm afraid.
I guess my time's up. Dr. Taylor, why don't you give us?
Yeah, just to echo, I mean, I agree that I think there is quite a lot of broad support, and certainly Putin's public approval ratings have gone up since the invasion. Obviously, it's very difficult to understand and gauge citizens' true preferences for the reasons that the ambassador was talking about. But I think, you know, one thing we have to keep an eye on is I talked about Putin mobilizing Russian society. So for years, the apathy, the passivity has been Putin's playbook. But what we're seeing is since he had to mobilize Russians and draw Russians into the war, there is much more active support. No longer can people be as passive as the ambassador is saying. That's been a real change. There's more citizens reporting on other citizens. The heartbreaking story of a father who was arrested because a little girl drew an anti-war picture. I mean, there is a lot of kind of citizens reporting on other, so Russia is moving from a demobilized society to a mobilized society, and I think we'll have to keep an eye on that for what kind of implications that produces for the future. But the one extra point I will very quickly make is there are many, 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 hundreds of thousands, something like 300,000 Russians have fled in the aftermath of the war. That provides an opportunity for the United States. And I think that's another area where the US Congress can do more to enable those Russians who have left. Not all, some of them were dodging, having to fight in the war, but there is a hearty number of civil society actors who have now left Russia. And so having a US Congress take actions and steps and provide resources that enable those Russians to continue their work from outside of Russia is very important. So we could fund research on understanding what that community looks like. We can increase funding to support those who are outside, creating a title program for human rights defenders and journalists. So those are opportunities, again, trying to find the opportunities that come out of this war and this huge population of Russians that are now outside the country, I do think represents an opportunity that we could tap into.
Thank you.
Senator Murphy.